I'm Jason. I work at Datadog. Datadog's a monitoring service. We make monitoring complex systems easier. So speaking of complex systems, we see a lot of that these days, right? You've got things like people running gigantic Hadoop clusters, and you got some crazy people running those on Docker, on top of Kubernetes, and the really crazy ones are running Kubernetes on top of Mesos. Like, what? So this isn't our first go-around, not these particular software solutions, but we saw the rise of the first generation of complex systems in the 1960s and 70s. And people started wondering how systems and humans interacted, and there was this myth that you could just throw more engineers or more developers at a project to get it done faster. So in 1974, Fred Brooks comes along and says, this is completely wrong. If you throw more engineers or devs at a project, particularly a late one, you make it worse, you make it later. So some of you are thinking, well, he was using waterfall methodology, I use Agile, I'm making an MVP, I'm iterating on it, not a problem. And you know, Brooks actually agreed with you. 20 years after he wrote his book, he released an update, and he said that iterative builds are better. And some of you are even thinking, well, none of this applies, right? Because Brooks was talking about software delivery, and I do continuous delivery. So I'm making a git push, and Travis kicks off the build, and everything just goes automatically. And the problem is that he really wasn't talking just about software delivery. Brooks wrote his statement in a book called The Mythical Man Month, and the focus of it really was about people and how people work, and the confusion that people had of how they can interchange time and people, which is really dangerous because you are not equivalent to the work that you can do in a month. So Brooks' law really boils down to three primary reasons. The first is that we lose time to ramping people up or onboarding them, and the second is that there's a limit to the divisibility of work. So we can only break up code in so many ways. And then the third is that there's a communications overhead. So if we just took these first two things, normally there'd be an arbitrary limit where you'd add people and then the productivity would just sort of level off and you couldn't get beyond that. But with the communications overhead that grows as people get added to a team, there's actually an inflection point, so things become worse. So if things are getting worse because we have teams that are growing and we need to scale teams as we scale systems, then maybe the solution is this, that we should just stop communicating, right? You have managers that constantly say things like this. They're watching you on Slack and like, what's this chat ops thing? Can't people just stop chatting and just get work done? Brooks actually argues for the exact opposite. Rather than not communicating, he says that we need to communicate more and in as many ways as possible. He really understood the value of informal communications and what we'd now call as asynchronous communications. So if we're actually trying to communicate more, what's the problem? Well, Brooks saw the problem was that communications is a network, and a lot of organizations try to force this network to conform to an organizational tree structure. And tree structures are there to help organizations scale, but they naturally tend to amplify some voices and to silence others. In DevOps, we often talk about the andon cord. It's the Toyota Kata. It's the cord that workers could pull to bring the production line to a halt if they saw a defect. And we often talk about it in terms of safety culture, but it's more than safety culture. It's about democracy. It was about empowering individuals and people throughout the organization to affect change and to have a say. In the Power of Scale, John Bodley talks about this, and he says that culture is the primary way that we redistribute the power and mitigate these effects of having scale, these detrimental effects. So if we're thinking about how we can empower people, really what we ought to be building is a culture of communication. Because with communications, we're not only informing people and providing them with empowering methods to make decisions, but we're actually encouraging decisions. And by encouraging them, it helps our operations to move faster. Jessica Kerr, or Jessitron on Twitter, had a great blog post recently about the CAP theorem of organizations and how we can get teams moving together in the same direction while they're disparate. And she notes that random communications across organizations have huge potential. So how can we break Brooks's law? Really, it comes down to DevOps culture. It's our value on communications and our value on valuing people and empowering them to get jobs done. Thanks.